Hi, here's Bob Hatton. Here is the encourager. And we're going to have a look at another parable that Jesus spoke to the people who were listening to him, to his disciples especially. And that's also in Luke chapter 13. And it's from the verse 20 and 21. And Jesus spoke once more, and he said, you know, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who takes some yeast and mishes it amongst the flour to make some bread. And there's a huge pile of flour and just a little piece of yeast. And this yeast, it goes through the whole mass of flour, and it influences. And that's what Jesus is talking about now. He's talking about influence of the kingdom of God in this world. And sometimes we are a little bit frightened because we think, because of all the bad things that are happening in the world, this bad, evil world will infect the kingdom of God. So the best thing to do is to withdraw and to isolate ourselves from the world so that we don't get into trouble. But actually, the reverse is true, and in the church history we see that, and that is that the kingdom of God engaged with the world, and the kingdom of God wasn't changed, but the world was changed. The yeast changes the flour doesn't change the yeast. And we saw this very small group of disciples that Jesus called. There was 12 when he called them. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to 500 people at one time. I suppose they were his followers, but they're not there on the day of Pentecost. There's only 120. But in the afternoon on the day of Pentecost, that church, it's suddenly grown from 120 to 3,120, and it continues to grow. We see another figure a few chapters later, and he talks about 5,000 men, and then there's some women, and then there's some children. So I suppose we could be speaking about 15 to 20,000. Then a little bit later, it talks about growth and expansion. But then we read about a multiplication of churches. And then later, towards the end of the book of the Acts of the Apostles, Paul goes back to Jerusalem. He meets James, the brother of Jesus, and James tells him that alone in the city of Jerusalem there are 10,000s of people who are following Jesus. And as we read in the early church history, we see how the church and the kingdom of God expands across the Roman Empire, and then even farther to the east. As Nestorians and the Church of the East, they even took the kingdom of God right into China. It's a very dramatic story into and all across the Silk Route in the east, but also to the west as far as Britannia. And there was a great expansion. Now, a man called Rodney Stark, who wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity, which is a very interesting book, but he says it wasn't the signs and wonders, and it wasn't the evangelism that caused the kingdom of God to dynamically grow in these first centuries. He reports about a pandemic that came to the city of Rome and some of the other large cities in the Roman Empire, and it was the city of Rome. It had some nice places where rich people lived, but most of the people were living in squalor and poverty. It was poor housing, and the hygiene was not very good. And this disease, this epidemic that became a worldwide epidemic, it came in there. And the rich people, the influent and affluent people, they left the city. They went to live on the places that they had in the country. But the poor people, the underprivileged people, they were left in the cities. They had nowhere to go. But the Christians stayed as well, and they looked after these people. And for some of these Christians, it meant that they paid for it with their lives. But others stayed. They looked after these sick people, and they gained influence. This was like the yeast and the flour. They were gaining influence. They were changing the world. And after the pandemic was over, we had a change there, and the Christianity was growing. They were still being persecuted, but they were growing in influence, and that has repeated itself in many places. It was Christians who often started schools and education, and also universities. Christians who were in the medical services. I remember reading about a Christian lady called Elizabeth Fry, who was a Quaker, a Christian, who reformed the prisons in England. Florence Nightingale, who the nurses even in Germany are still talking about today. She was a pioneer in the medical world as far as nursing was concerned. And we could think of many other incidences. And so my encouragement for us today is that we don't withdraw from the world. We don't become part of the world. We've got to be in the world, not of the world, but we are the ones that influence him. We are the yeast and have the power from the King of Kings to influence the whole batch of flour and to change it to look something more like the kingdom of God. So be encouraged, whatever you are doing. There is this wonderful word in, I think I quoted it yesterday, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's the work that you do in the Lord is not in vain. Is not in vain. God bless you. Have a good day. You're Bob Hatton.